It's like one of those one-eyed monsters. What are those things? Cyclops in mythology. A Cyclops thinks one thing. A Cyclops is like a giant penis, by the way. I mean, from a symbolic perspective, it's the same idea, because it's usually something masculine and single-minded. Okay, so, and the idea is that that masculine, single-minded thing is a personality that's dominated by a single motivational state. And that makes it extremely powerful and giant-like, but also kind of blind and lumbering, right? Because it only wants one thing. That little monster that you grew inside your head, which is one of these cyclops, it's going to pop up and shut the rest of you down. And so that's not so good. And so the addiction isn't a behavior that's manifested in response to a cue, and it's not craving. It's the manifestation of a full-fledged, one-dimensional personality with its own perceptions, emotions, motivations, and cognitions that wants one thing and does not care about anything else. Well, maybe it also cares about the other things that you think to hell with, because, you know, that's in the associated cognitive web. So that's what grows. But addicting is complicated. Addicting means that it grows an addicted personality in your head. That's why it's so hard to get unaddicted. It's not just a matter of getting rid of the craving. That's nothing. You can put someone in a cell for 3 days and they won't be going through withdrawal anymore. They won't crave as long as they're there. You're opening yourself up fundamentally to something like possession by a Dionysius. Of course, you like that because Dionysius is a very short-term, pleasure-seeking, sort of lustful type of sub-personality, and you got to repress that most of the time because, you know, it's not very sightly. But if you drink enough wine, whoa, you know, fun. You can do all the stupid things that really give you a dopamine kick but aren't so good for you in the long run. So, and it's best to think about that as a personality. So, here's something interesting you may or may not know. Medieval people, when they talked about the 7 deadly sins, so that's 7 deadly ways to miss the target, right? They personified each of the sins, which I love because it's so sophisticated. It's far more sophisticated than the way we conceptualize mental disease, because we think of the brain as a subset of something like robotic cognitive circuits. It's like, no, wrong. You're a collection of personalities, sub-personalities, loosely ruled by you. But all those sub-personalities, those are bloody powerful forces. And they're not just cognitive circuits. They have their own viewpoint. And I really mean that. Like, they see the world a particular way, which is the way you see the world when you want to have sex, or when you're hungry, or when you're thirsty, or when you're angry, or when you want revenge, or whatever. Those are real things, and they're not little circuits. They're alive, and you can make them grow and dominate. So this is pride. Pride is the thing that makes you think you know everything. And it's associated with a descent into hell. That's good. That makes a lot of sense. When I get to the bottom of my clinical client's pathology, and this is for people who are really suffering, there's usually, the things that I find at the bottom are usually one of two or both. One is pride. The people, especially the people who have something like personality disorder, they bloody well think that they can get away with tricks and that no one is smart enough to figure it out. And if they don't think that, a family member thinks it. And so it's appallingly arrogant. Appallingly. Another thing that's often at the bottom is resentment, which is this notion that life is terrible, generally speaking, but it's terrible for me in a specific way in that I've been picked out for a particular form of unjust misery. And that allows me to be righteous in my anger and to torture people half to death. You get a good combination of resentment and arrogance going. You can be sure that you'll end up in something that is pretty much indistinguishable from hell, and also that feels like it lasts for an eternity. Yeah. And then there's avarice. Well, 2008 pretty much, is our lesson for that. That's narrowing of the value structure to a specific kind of greed-like pursuit, right? And why is it wrong? Well, it's because you sacrifice everything else of value to it. And you lose the balance, and then you lose the equilibrated state. Not good. Lust, that's a lovely drawing. I like it a lot because it kind of indicates this sort of animal-like nature, which of course is what you'd expect for sexual arousal, right? It's an massively archaic biological force. And it's transpersonal too because, you all partake in it, but it's superordinate to everyone, of course. So, envy, sloth, gluttony, all with their own associated devil. Lovely symbolic representations, dreamlike representations, really. And if you do analysis of people's dreams, when they're suffering from one form or another, you often find representations in the dreams that are, vaguely reminiscent of sometimes not so vaguely either. I had a psychotic client once who had been doing immunological research at McGill, and he was under a lot of pressure because his older brother was a doctor, another one was a lawyer, a lot of second-generation immigrant, ambition pressure in his family. He couldn't get his master's degree to work properly, so he faked it out and handed in the thesis, and that night he woke up and saw the devil sitting at the foot of his bed, and that was when he disintegrated into a psychotic state. Now, you can explain that biologically, no problem, I think, because, it sounds kind of like a little bit of an epileptic episode induced by stress or something like that. But the phenomenology is part of the experience, too. And those things are a lot more common than you'd think. There's anger. That's resentment, most specifically. See, and this is Satan right here, thrown out of heaven. And he's trapped in ice, which I really like because he's immobile and cold. So he can't move. And the reason he can't move is because he's plotting revenge, essentially. And to see someone in a state like that really is awful. This is from Shakespeare. You might think about it as the credo of personality that's trapped by vengeful anger. Why should wrath be mute and fury dumb? I am no baby. I, that with base prayers I should repent the evils I have done. 10,000 worse that ever yet I did would I perform if I might have my will. If one good deed in all my life I did, I do repent it from my very soul. Yeah, well, you don't hear psychiatric diagnosis of that sort very often. But you see it a lot more often than you'd think, because I see in my clients certainly suicidal impulses that are destructive beyond belief, but also equally frequently homicidal impulses, and generated for all sorts of reasons. Ugly situations. More on conception of mental health. Let's see here. What have I got for time? I want to talk a little bit about self-deception. All right, so let's talk about mental health. One of the things that I've noticed also about psychiatric and psychological diagnosis, this isn't so true when you think about work mostly done in the 1950s by the existentialist psychotherapists. And this was sort of in the aftermath of World War II, when people were particularly concerned with moral choice. The existentialists were very interested in authenticity and inauthenticity as markers of health and illness, respectively. And to me, that's very much reminiscent of Freud's distinction between whatever the opposite of repression is and repression. And the problem is, I think to some degree, both of those groups of thinkers were sort of mealy-mouthed about the real issue. Because Freudian repression is actually something like deception. It's something like a lie. And, Freud didn't use words that bold because they're so contaminated, in a sense, with ethical judgment. But repression is, at minimum, the attempt to not be conscious about something you could be conscious about. And it might interest you to know that under English common law, that's a crime. So if you're a CEO, for example, and you suspect that your chief financial officer might be cooking the books, so that bothers you, affectively, but you decide, well, as long as I don't look at the damn books, that won't be a problem. You're criminally liable for that if you get exposed, because the English common law system presumes that you have an ethical obligation to be conscious of the things that you do that aren't appropriate, that you could be conscious of. So in Freud's repression, to some degree there's ethical discussion about it. That happens more particularly in Jung. But the ethical aspect of it is distinctly underplayed. And you see the same thing with the existentialist authenticity versus inauthenticity. Let's make it stark. One is a form of lying and the other isn't. It's as simple as that. And lying really makes a big difference to people, and it's really underdiagnosed as a cause of psychiatric disorder.